Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and one of the best parts about quilting is shopping for the fabric. And when we only need 3 fabrics for the quilt, it is easy to shop for because there are so many possibilities we can get with only 3 different fabrics. So let's do a quilt with 3 different fabrics, and each of the fabrics only need to be at 1 yard. So we need a total of 3 yards of fabric, and that's going to give us a quilt and with the binding. The fabric I'm using today is from QT Fabrics, and it's called Circle of Friends. And the free pattern I'm using is from Fabric Cafe. Fabric Cafe has a whole series of books out, and they're all designed around 3-yard quilts, which means 3 yards of fabric will make a lap size quilt. If you like larger quilts, you're going to be able to increase the fabric, and you will get 2 yards of each of the 3 colors. Will give you a twin size quilt. If you want it even bigger, if you do 3 yards of each of the 3 fabrics, you'll be able to get a larger queen or king size quilt top. And each of the books are designed around this theory of being able to do quilts with 3 different fabrics. And there's so many different possibilities and fun different patterns that you can do with only 3 yards. Fabric Cafe also has the free pattern online, so you can go in and print this out and follow along. Nice big pieces. The quilt and the patterns have been designed to maximize the fabric, so there's very little waste. So it's important that we follow the cutting directions in order. This quilt is designed around 1 block, but the block is done in 2 different color variations, and that is what's giving this a woven look. We have block A and block B, and we get to strip set these. So let's get cutting that fabric. The pattern starts off that we cut 3 strips, the width of the fabric, at 6 inches. These 3 long pieces are going to be turned into strip sets. You can put those aside for the strip sets. The next cut also needs to be 6 inches. And from this one piece, we need to cut that strip into a 25-inch piece. That 25-inch is also going to be a strip set, just a smaller one. We're going to continue cutting this, and we get to cut it now for the border. And it's going to be for border number 3. We need to cut 5 pieces at 2 inches. The next fabric I'm going to cut is my number 2 fabric. We need 3 strips cut at 6 inches, the width of the fabric. Those also are going to be long strip sets. 1 more strip at 6 inches, and this time we need to cut this strip to 17 inches. For the remainder of that yard, we need to have 5 strips cut at 1.5 inches. And those 1.5-inch strips are going to be for border number 2. We need to start and cut 12 strips the width of the fabric at 1.5 inches. And those will go on the sides of each of those long strip sets. We now need to cut the little strips that are going to go on these shorter pieces. Those strips are going to come from 2 strips cut at 1.5 inches, and from each of these pieces, cut 25 inches and then 17 inches. The 2 25 inches are going to go on the side of fabric number 1, which leaves us the 2 17-inch strips, which will match in fabric number 2. Cut 5 more strips at 1.5 inches. These 5 strips are going to be border number 1. The remainder is going to be cut for binding. Now the binding throughout the series is cut at a single fold, which means it only needs to be cut at 1.25 inches. So we will need 5 pieces cut at 1.25 inches. If you want a wider binding, you're going to have a little bit more fabric, so you could buy an additional ½ yard. I'm going to use the single fold binding, so I need to cut this 5 strips at 1.25 inches. From that 1 yard, we only have a little strip of fabric. We need 5 of these strips for the binding plus 10 inches. So we're going to take it from one of the 1.5-inch pieces. So for the border, we're going to need these 4 pieces, subtracting a 10-inch piece. Then that little 10-inch piece needs to be trimmed down to 1.25 inches to match the rest of the binding. We can now put the 5 strips and that 1 10-inch strip aside for the binding, and we'll cover that later. The 5 strips minus that little 10-inch becomes border number 1. This is all we're going to need to make the quilt. 6 long strip sets, 2 short strip sets, 3 borders, and the binding. So let's sew the strip sets together. All the strip sets need to be sewn the same way. We have those skinny little 1.5-inch pieces that need to be stitched on top of that 6-inch piece. And now we can sew a 1/4 inch along each edge. We need to turn this strip into 8-inch squares. So cut each section to 8 inches and do that for all of the strip sets. We will have a total of 18 of the A blocks and 17 of the B blocks. Take 4 blocks out of block number A and put them aside, and take 3 of block number B and put them aside. Take block A and twist it once. We now will be able to sew this entire pile together. Match up the seams and stitch a 1/4 inch, leaving your extra blocks aside. We now have 14 units. Divide this in half and sew those units together. Match up the seams and stitch a 1/4 inch. When the 4 blocks are together, we're going to have a total of 7 of these units, and each of these units will make a row. The units will be stitched together so that the blocks are going to be opposite. And as we do that, we're going to need a block on each end. And that's where those extra pieces come in. So we'll be able to put block B on one side and block A on the other. We will need 4 rows with A onto one end and 3 rows with B block on the other end. So we can just sew those together. Once the 7 rows are complete, we're going to be able to sew them together so every other row is joining. Match right seams and stitch the 1/4 inch. With the 7 rows put together, the body of the quilt is done. The next we'll be adding on our 3 borders. The first fabric that we put on is fabric number 3, then fabric number 2, and fabric number 1. The strips of fabric are going to need to be stitched together in order to make the sizes we're going to need for the length. And to sew those strips together, we're going to sew the seams straight, not on a 45 angle. That straight seam is going to utilize the fabric better. Each border we're going to sew on the sides first, and then the top and bottom. So we'll do that for the first border, do the same for the second, and the same for the third. With those 3 borders on, the quilt top is now done. And the quilt does equal 44.5 inches by 59.5 inches. Now we did cut some binding, and the binding is an economical binding. So it's not a double fold, it is a single fold binding. And let me show you how to put that binding on a sample. So we will put all of the binding strips together and sew those strips together with a straight seam, not a 45, to maximize the fabric. The strips were cut at 1 1/4 inch. Take those strips and fold and press them in half so the right sides are out. Then on one side, we're going to press in to that center fold. So we will have a little bit of a seam allowance. And this is how we're going to prepare the binding before we put it on the quilt. Once those strips are sewn and pressed, we're going to be able to sew it on the edge of the quilt. We'll be sewing this little piece on to the quilt. We're going to use a very scant 1/4 inch. And that stitch needs to be a little bit less than what you see hanging out. We're going to have the right side of the binding run along the edge of the quilt. When we look at it, the raw edges are matching and that little piece is folded into the center. Move this out of the way and stitch along that one edge. We're going to do the corners the same as we would the regular double fold binding, and then stitch down. That stitching line needs to be a little bit smaller than where that fold is, because we're going to take this and move it to the back. Pick this up and move it right to the back. So this is the little piece that has been pressed inside, and then it's going to come forward. And this is where we can do the hand stitching or the machine stitching. So we have the front and the back. And those corners are going to be treated the same way. Tucked in and stitched. The binding looks the same. The only difference is this fabric only has one layer along the edge versus two. The 3-yard quilts are a lot of fun to make because after all, we only need 3 yards and only 3 different fabrics, so it's very easy to choose the fabric lines. They make great gifts for babies and for teenagers going back to school. They also make great charity quilts because there's so many different fabrics that can be used in 3 different yards. And a lot of the patterns we can use great big prints that we don't like to cut up. Very much like the Sew Fast quilt. I'll put a link in the description to the free pattern called Sew Fast, and a lot of the books can be bought in your local quilt store. I'd like to thank Fabric Cafe for sending me their new fabric line and sharing the free pattern with me so that I could share it with you. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.